Okay, so we are live.
So Dave, go ahead.
All right. We still live? I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, we're live.
Okay, good. So I'm Dave Feldman at University of California, Irvine. It's a real pleasure to invite everyone to this workshop on green infrastructure adoption. And the topic of this particular panel is governance and policy. I think, as we all know, while green infrastructure has many variables associated with it, engineering, biophysical, and obviously built environment implications, governance and policy are really critical. Why don't we go around and each of the panelists, please introduce yourself so we know who's all here.
All right, my name is Stanley Grant, and I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine.
And I'm Megan Rippey. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Irvine.
I'm Andrea from the University of Melbourne.
Great to have you.
I'm John Peng from Orange County Public Works.
Scott Taylor with Michael Baker International.
And I'm Stephanie Hamill, working as a Water Sensitive Urban Design Officer at Yarra Ranges Council.
My name is Brandon Winfrey, and I'm a postdoc scholar at UCLA.
James, I think you're it.
All right.
All right, and James Beam, I'm the main administrator on the Water-PIRE program.
So let's go with the first presentation.
All right, so I believe the first presentation is actually you, Dave. So Dave, are you ready to get started with your presentation?
Yes, can you go ahead and
So Dave, you can go ahead and get started. I've shared your PowerPoint slides with everyone who's going to be watching. So they'll be following along from each of their own computers. So you're just able to start your presentation whenever you'd like.
okay.
Hey, James, you might mute yourself. There's some background static too, I think, or mute all of us except for Dave.
So let me just go ahead by saying that in this overview of governance issues for low-impact development, I want to draw some broad lessons from the U.S. and Australia that I think will help sort of kick us off and get us to think about governance and planning issues from a broad perspective. Governance is really a process for solving problems through law and regulation and collaboration. And for low-impact development or green infrastructure, it's really a way of establishing and enforcing acceptable levels of risk and developing programs to reduce or remove contaminants from green infrastructure projects. And I think governance also encompasses planning, the process of creating more convenient, equitable, healthful, efficient, and attractive places in our built environment. Australia and the United States, particularly Southern California, provide some important lessons, I think, for land use and water planning and governance. I often like to start out by a framework for understanding governance for LID generally, and that is to think of governance as kind of having three components. One is the process by which decisions are made, which is the interplay of various agencies and non-governmental organizations, citizen groups, and so forth, who at times are interested in regulating the process, at other times are interested in promoting it, and in most cases we understand that process forensically by doing case studies of how governance has worked in the introduction of low impact development. A second component is power, which is the relative ability of different parties to determine outcomes, and as we know, that's very critical in low impact development as it is in other aspects of water and environmental decision making. Not all economic and environmental interests have the same power or authority to make decisions. And again, we want to look at case studies and triangulate evidence so that we understand how these decisions are made. And then, of course, is purpose, which is a third component. And various protagonists may have differing goals. Some might want to introduce low-impact development to maximize protection of the environment. Others to seek ways of maximizing economic development. And still others might want to look at this tool as a means of minimizing costs to taxpayers and to various levels of governance. And so we could do surveys and polls and studies of policy history to understand how that works. In Australia, as a general rule, we could say that state and territorial governments have overall authority for land and water uses. We know that catchment management trusts and management boards would prepare plans and undertake works and encourage community participation for LID as well as for other related green infrastructure policies. We also know that localities have to embrace management guidelines set by these federal and state policies, but that there is a good deal of discretion in how they're done. And this is one of the things that we've learned in comparing, for example, with the United States, where federal regulations, particularly on stormwater regulations, through the Clean Water Act, actually has a huge role in regulating discharges from municipal storm sewer systems, construction activities, and other point source wastewater dischargers. So similarities, but also some notable differences in terms of the amount of discretion permitted. In the US and in Australia, the issue of stormwater management in particular and the need for low impact development and governance concerns regarding it are, I think, have become equally critical issues. I believe many studies would suggest that Australia is ahead of the United States, ahead of California, certainly, in terms of implementing a lot of measures, but a lot of the issues are now coming to the fore with concerns over stormwater management, pollution, keeping pollutants out of bays and estuaries, and so forth. So a lot of similarities and a lot of similarly urgent problems. Stormwater governance, focusing on Victoria, we noticed that a lot of the governance innovations were developed during the period of the Millennium Drought. And they include, among other things, local government development consents, what we would call in the United States planning codes, to encourage the use of rainwater tanks connected to roofs that provide harvestable stormwater for gardens, for toilets, even for clothes and car washing. And of course, above and underground stormwater storage and on-site detention systems. And here, what we're interested in from a governance standpoint is the use of incentives that have been given to developers and property owners, including rebates on water and sewer charges, as a governance means of encouraging the adoption of various green infrastructure or low impact development methods. In the United States, and in California in particular, the innovations have been a lot more recent than in the Millennium Drought. And from a governance standpoint, they're still very much evolving. And I'll use the example of Los Angeles, which in 2011 developed a low-impact development ordinance, which applies to all businesses and most residences in the city. The goal is to reduce impervious surface, and it was established as an ordinance in collaboration with non-governmental organizations, business groups, particularly the building industry, and also the real estate market. Basically, it mandates adoption for almost all new or renovated properties, but it places a great deal of emphasis on the choice of innovation, fitted hopefully to the neighborhoods in which they're being located. A lot of redevelopment projects are designed to capture stormwater at the source and to utilize rain barrels, permeable pavement, storage tanks, infiltration swales, and so forth. A lot of benefits have been touted, including water conservation, groundwater recharge, and greening neighborhoods. But a big governance challenge in Southern California is sustaining these efforts, at least in Los Angeles. That is to say, how much of them can actually be then turned over to neighborhoods for sustaining? And it's basically an open question. We don't really have the answer. We do know that there's a great deal of potential for stormwater capture, particularly in Southern California, through neighborhood level best management practices and through rooftop capture. And that many water agencies, and we're going to learn more about this later in terms here of Orange County Public Works, many water agencies anticipate a greater reliance on stormwater harvesting, but land use and regulatory issues still make adoption somewhat slow. And so this is a big governance challenge here in our region. One of the differences also in terms of governance is principles and practices for reuse. Again, using Australia as an example, and Victoria in particular, there's been a great emphasis over time on developing gradations of water quality for different end uses, and wide latitude that's been granted to states, including Victoria, in setting a certain amount of risk standards, particularly for rainwater and stormwater. And this is one of the things that from a governance standpoint may permit a wide latitude in the application of green infrastructure. We're not quite as sophisticated from a governance standpoint here in the United States, certainly not in Southern California. So this is a challenge when we compare governance across societies and what we can learn from one another. We also know that there are issues of public acceptance, and when we talk about governance and we talk about power and process and purpose, we're very concerned with the degree to which the public accepts various stormwater end uses. There's been a great deal of research in Australia that has shown that while the public recognizes its potential as an alternative source of water supply, there are some reservations that are geared to the perceptions of health risks, closely related to the proximity of the end uses to human contact. And we know that the public more strongly prefers uses with limited human contact, where the quality is guaranteed and the uses are, for the most part, non-potable. We also know that dual pipe supply systems, one for recycled wastewater, the other for harvested stormwater, again encouraged by local government and state government policies, have made end uses, we think, a bit more tractable, a bit easier than in the United States. By contrast, we know that a lot of these issues in the United States, from the standpoint of governance, are more aspirational. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, in their latest strategic plan in 2014, has suggested some major changes to the urban environments in the United States that can improve health in the environment through, in particular, adopting strong stormwater management policies. which would have strong connections to the built environment and a great deal of encouragement to states and localities to develop these. California, which has a state water plan that has gone through several iterations, most recently in 2014, explicitly encourages stormwater capture, floodplain reconnection projects, and potable wastewater reuse to improve the environment, to reduce flooding, and to increase water supplies. And a very explicit goal is to make communities resilient against drought by supporting and expanding funding for integrated water management planning and projects that increase self-reliance, especially through stormwater reuse. So it's explicit in public policy in the state. And very interesting, similar to Australia, but not yet as successful in implementation, is incentivizing and co-funding multi-benefit projects, including stormwater management. One of the challenges is that under the California Water Action Plan, it is up to communities and it is up to water utilities to co-generate potential stormwater harvesting projects, which the state will then fund. The state won't establish them. The notion is to put the onus on local governments and local utilities to come up with plans. So very much a work in progress. In terms of the future, we know that each country has certain strategies and aspirations in mind. In Australia, the Council of Australian Governments has developed a number of strategic frameworks and has modified those frameworks over time to permit various water reforms that would not only enhance green infrastructure, but other water innovations. These include reforms related to water pricing, to institutions, to sustainability, and to mechanisms for community consultation. Explicit requirements exist for water quality, as we noted previously, for continuing and promoting water-related research, although the vagaries of funding certainly play into part in terms of promoting that continued research, and very explicit aspirations for public consultation and education. The framework in particular promotes innovation in stormwater storage and reuse as a supplement to existing services through building public support for changes in urban planning and design. And many of us think that from a governance innovation, this is perhaps one of the strongest sets of lessons or suites of lessons that could be applied to the United States. That is to think of urban planning and urban planning processes as in effect a governance overlay that could provide some real benefits in terms of accelerating the adoption of green infrastructure. I want to look at some conclusions for us to think about, particularly as we listen in more detail to the subsequent presentations. And I want to start with some future governance challenges. And a question that we can ask ourselves for both Australia and the United States, and Australia and California more specifically, is how easily can stormwater management and other low-impact development innovations be integrated into the urban landscape at multiple scales, not just a region-wide or city-wide innovation, but an innovation that can be integrated, for example, at neighborhood scales. These are questions that still remain to be asked. It seems that this is one of the challenges we have in the United States and in California, is making sure that these innovations can be integrated, particularly at neighborhood scales, as has been done in Victoria, certainly in Melbourne. And can regulatory frameworks be developed or be improved to encourage water substitution and minimizing health risks, all while also encouraging buy-in by the private sector, by private investors? We know this will require a great deal of flexibility. It's a challenge that both societies share. It's a challenge that has not been met, I think, as avidly in the United States, although California is starting to make some inroads here. And in terms of governance, we know that there are advantages and disadvantages in having more centralized approaches, where higher levels of government sort of mandate the adoption of innovations, as opposed to more decentralized approaches, which say these things should really come from an upswelling of public demand and local governance demand. In fact, probably there's something to be said for both approaches, but with an understanding that somehow creative ways need to be found to use the best of centralization combined with decentralization in some magic balance. And this was probably one of those things that from a governance standpoint, as I think we're going to see in the other presentations, is something that kind of develops over time. There's no real formula for this. We know that in Australia there's a long tradition of urban design innovation, particularly in places like Melbourne, and a quest overall for what is often termed in the literature livability. While not specifically aimed solely at green infrastructure or low-impact development, the widespread acceptance of an ethos of livability certainly helps in terms of developing stormwater harvesting and other green infrastructure as a way of having it linked to other aspects of the built environment and of urban design innovation. There is widespread acceptance of these approaches, especially among the middle and upper classes, we believe, precisely because it is linked to this notion of urban livability. This is something that's starting to catch on in places like Los Angeles, but we've still got a ways to go. And I think in Los Angeles and Orange County, we're going to become leaders nationally in this. That is to say, in the United States. Also, the role of governmental coordination in terms of this centralized, decentralized governance problem. In Victoria, state law and the overlay of federal law encourages local governments and water providers to coordinate supply projects, to coordinate allocation decisions, to coordinate water use priorities. This certainly came out of the Millennium Drought. By California, I would dare say that until 2015, policy responses in these areas tended to be almost wholly locally driven, to the detriment of more comprehensive mandates. And this is one of the things that our current governor has tried to change, largely due to the pressures imposed on the state by the drought, in which basically the state has sort of mandated specific targets. And while there's been some discussion as to whether or not that's the optimal way to do this from a governance standpoint, it's probably the best way, at least in the short term, that these things will be agendized in California. I want to conclude by talking about methods for encompassing governance issues in low-impact development and implementation approaches. And one of the things I did in an earlier presentation that was highlighted was the notion of thinking of governance and governance issues as something that could be systematized and thus applied not only to Australia, not only to the United States, but ultimately could be a model for thinking about governance and low-impact development everywhere. And this includes a conceptual framework for harvesting stormwater, which combines the work of hydrologists and others in watershed and water quality modeling to evaluate impacts, to then integrate those analyses with water management plans that are developed by water agencies and urban planners, to undertake economic evaluations of the benefits and the costs of these various plans, and then to engage various publics in the evaluation, engaging community responses. These things together could lead to risk-based and vulnerability analysis-based outcomes that will then ultimately lead to a suite of strategies that can be evaluated by various groups and then hopefully introduced. And this is a way both of aspirationally describing how governance could work, but I think it's also a way of thinking about how governance issues do work in reality. Although each of these components remains to sort of reach a level of maturity that would be optimal. So with that, I will stop. And James, our next step is to go to another presentation, or do we take questions at this point?
We can open it up for a couple of minutes of Q&A if anyone had any specific questions for Dave. Now's the time to ask them.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Dave, this is Stanley Grant. So in your framework for thinking about LID, do you have any specific examples that you can point to in the U.S. or in Victoria where that entire process was played out in the kind of integrated way that you envisioned?
I think there are a couple of examples. I think that the Living Victoria, Living Melbourne plan during the Millennium Drought, though it was not structured solely around low-impact development, in fact did follow something structurally and aspirationally that sort of fits this framework. That is to say, you start out sort of from two ends. You start out certainly from the technical realm of looking at what's feasible and what impacts would be, but also bringing in at various levels economic evaluations and also public and intergovernmental consultations as a way of evaluating various options and their outcomes. That process, as we know, and as our friends from Melbourne could amplify in much greater detail than I, have had their ups and downs, including the termination, formal termination of the program, even though vestiges of it exist in other places. But I think that's an example of where we see, at least aspirationally, the attempt to kind of systematize this, and in the process incorporating not only technical and policy issues, but sort of melding centralization or centrally driven sorts of concerns and mandates with bottom-up approaches. So I would say that's one. I would say a second one might be the example of what's taking place in Orange County, which I know that John Peng is going to talk about in a little while. But I think in South Orange County, and particularly many of the innovations are an attempt at looking at what we know about low-impact developments and how they can be sort of accelerated in their adoption, but to do so with processes of consultation of landowners, community residents, potential real estate investors, and those sorts of things. Again, these processes don't work in a pure linear fashion, but I think elements of them are starting to take hold.
Just as a follow-up, maybe ask if Stephanie and Andrea can weigh in on their perspectives of that diagram from an Australian viewpoint, and in particular through the lens of Little Stringybark Creek. If you feel like that that process more or less conformed to Dave's vision, or was separate from it.
I was actually going to ask a follow-up question. So I'm not very well keyed into the broader policy movements in Melbourne and Victoria, but you've made reference to the Millennium Drought and the Living Victoria initiative coming out of that. I wonder, do you think that governments require some sort of crisis before they start these initiatives? Because the Millennium Drought was exactly that. It was a crisis.
That's
so I'm
a
curious.
wonderful, yeah. That's a wonderful question, and I think the answer I would give is absolutely the case. I think that there's a tendency toward what we would call in the policy field path dependency, which is, and sort of latent in my presentation, that governments do what they've done because they've always done it that way. And there almost has to be a crisis to sort of force them to get out of that path-dependent paradigm. And I think that's certainly what happened to some extent in Melbourne. And I think that's what's happening in Southern California and California more generally. A lot of the knowledge, a lot of the baseline information that we've needed to adopt green infrastructure innovations has been here for a very, very long time. But there's been very little driving governments to change their outlook and their perspectives and to seriously try to incentivize these things until California entered a fourth year of a very significant drought.
And I guess
Great.
as a follow-up.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, do you think that other parts of the United States will also wait for their own crisis, or do you think they will see what's going on in California and adopt earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a little bit more of the latter, where I think they're going to wait to see how things turn out in California, and a little bit of crisis might push things along. In another region of the United States that I'm familiar with, which is the Southeast, which went through a terrible drought some years ago, particularly Atlanta. They had very, very similar issues to Los Angeles. They started out with a baseline of generally having more precipitation, but they ended up with demands really outrunning available supplies. There was some discussion of adopting green infrastructure innovations, but it seemed to fall on deaf ears. There were no real champions within local or state governments to adopt these measures. What they did end up doing is adopting some, for that region, fairly strenuous demand-side programs in terms of water conservation, but not the innovations. And I think it's because they saw green infrastructure as just too thorny an issue in terms of land use, property rights, the legalities of instituting it, I think, were beyond where they wanted to go. So I think they're going to watch and wait to see what places like California do as a harbinger of how they might push these innovations through in the future.
Great. Well, thank you. I think for the, just for the sake of time, we'll move forward. Right? And we have Andrea, who will be talking about incentivizing in a little part.
Okay, great. So I should continue. So this presentation is quite narrow in some respects, so it's focused on an experience in the Little Stringybark Creek, which is a creek on the edge of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. And I'm an economist, so it's very much focused on the design of incentives in order to encourage the kind of adoption that we were just talking about. So I'm going to move to my slide number 2, which is my very poor attempt at defining the problem from what I would consider a scientific perspective. And this is just, I guess, I always like to start with problem definition, and I'll move on to an economist's problem definition in a second. So the idea is that, development has fundamentally changed the landscape. We've increased the amount of impervious surfaces, particularly in urban environments, and that has led to degradation of streams and also downstream water bodies like Port Phillip Bay in the case of Melbourne. So if I move on to slide 3 and away from the attempt at the scientific definition and talk about an economist's definition of the problem, what we have is a classic schematic. And this schematic is demonstrating what's called a social externality. So here there's a diagram. On the horizontal axis I've got the quantity of concrete, and on the vertical axis is the cost and benefit of certain actions. And the point of this diagram is to contrast what are the private costs and benefits for individuals who are thinking about, say, concreting their driveway versus the social costs of those actions. So the social costs are the damage that that concrete would do to the local waterway. So you can see that if we just focus on the private cost schedule, what is happening is that that schedule just describes that every quantity of concrete, what is the private cost to the individual of putting in an additional unit of concrete on their driveway. If we compare that to the social cost schedule, for every unit of concrete, the social cost is higher than the private cost. So what does that mean? Well, it means that society bears an additional cost that the household or the individual on the allotment at the allotment scale is not bearing. So the private benefit schedule is the downward sloping diagram, and that describes at every point, at every quantity of concrete, what's the benefit to the individual of an additional unit of concrete. So what's the benefit of that driveway? So this household is going to make a decision based on the private cost and the private benefit, and that's going to lead to what I've called market quantity of the quantity of concrete. But if they had considered the full cost of their actions, so the social cost of their actions, including the damage to the nearby creek, then we would have, then they would have put in place less concrete, and we'd be at this optimum Q. So you can see that the market quantity is above the optimum social quantity, and that outcome is inefficient. So that's what we call an externality, and that's the problem that we need to address. So I move on to slide 4. I want to characterize, okay, well, we've got this problem. What's our objective in trying to fix that problem? And as an economist, I would say, well, what we're trying to do is align private incentives with the social interest. So we want that person who's making the decision about the driveway to think about not just the private cost, but the social cost of their actions. Another way of framing that is just that we want to provide efficient levels of public goods. But we don't really know what the true social cost or benefit of that concreted driveway is. That's not something that we have a good handle on. And so we kind of move on to a more practical objective, which is that we want to set a target for, say, a particular environmental outcome, or we want to allocate a budget, a particular volume of money, to encourage certain actions. And so our objective moves from kind of this global optimum to a much narrower objective, which is to minimize the cost of achieving a certain target or to maximize the environmental benefit to a stream from a given set fixed budget. So that's our more narrow objective. So on slide 5, once we've kind of articulated what our objective is, then we need to consider, well, how are we going to meet that objective given the features of the problem that we're faced with? So we think about the Little Stringybark Creek. We're talking about households who are at various locations. Their blocks are, they have different terrain, so some of them are steeper than others. Some of these households live closer to the creek than others. So what is the point of discussing that? Well, what I'm trying to get at is that these households have heterogeneous costs and benefits. So, for example, installing a rain barrel, what we would call a water tank in Victoria, is going to be very cheap for some households and very expensive for others. And that same rain barrel may have very high benefits to the creek if it's installed in one location, but very different benefits to the creek if it's installed in another. So we want to be able to identify which are the lowest cost households to install a tank at, and which tank also gives the greatest benefit to the local stream. That's a feature of the problem that we're trying to solve. We also have multiple scales of intervention. So we could install that tank at the allotment scale on a household's property, but we could also undertake a streetscape project down the road. And that is at a fundamentally different scale. It has different costs and benefits. And so we want to be able to identify, well, what is the optimal portfolio of projects at our disposal? And then, in essence, we also need to deal with the potential for synergies amongst those projects and threshold effects. So maybe we're not going to have any benefit on the stream if we haven't been able to install a certain volume of tanks. That's another characteristic of the problem that we might want to take into account. So moving on to slide 6. These are just essentially a summary of the problems and how we're going to address them using some pretty simple principles. So when we're thinking about a policy, we want that policy mechanism to enable us to jointly consider both streetscapes works and installations at the property or allotment scale. And in order to do that, we need to do 2 things. We need to compare the benefits of these different types of projects, and we also need to be able to compare the costs of those different types of projects. And then we also want our mechanism not only to tell us what are the benefits and what are the costs, but we need some sort of selection rule that's going to enable us to select the optimal portfolio of those investments. So on slide 7, the first step then is to construct some way of measuring the benefits across these different types of projects. So we want to develop a metric, which is not developed by economists, it's developed by scientists, so in this case, hydrologists and ecologists. And that metric is essentially a measure of environmental benefit. So that metric is going to summarize both the impact on the creek, the Little Stringybark Creek in this case, but also our preferences over those impacts. So we might care about some impacts more than others. And all of that information is summarized in this metric. So that metric allows us to compare benefits of different interventions across different locations, across different scales, and across different types of installations. On slide 8, so we've now, if we understand what the benefit side is, we now need to understand what the cost side is. And this is where economists kind of come into their own. So if we think about streetscape scale projects, we might think that local governments might have a good sense of what does it cost to undertake a particular project. So they're relatively well known, those costs. But at least before you start a project like Little Stringybark Creek, we don't have much of a sense of, well, what are the private costs? What does it cost a household to install a tank at a particular location? So the cost of installing a tank on a particular block, that's a private cost, and we would say that that private cost is hidden from the decision maker. It's not known. So a mechanism like an auction does two things. So first of all, it asks people to tell us what their costs are, so that's one characteristic of an auction, but it also, because it provides a bit of competitive pressure for households, it encourages households to reveal that cost truthfully. So we can certainly just go and ask households, well, how much would it cost to put a tank on your land? But they have an incentive to tell us that it costs a little bit more than it actually does. So they have an incentive to shade and ask for a bit more money than they actually would be willing to accept. And so that's the second important feature of an auction mechanism, that it encourages households to be truthful in their revelation. So on slide 9, an auction is not an auction is not an auction. So there are many different types of auctions, and in the Little Stringybark Creek, we narrowed the field down to basically 2 potential types of auctions, and each auction faces households with a different set of incentives. So on the left is just a picture of a discriminatory price auction. In these auctions, so if I put in a bid, I say, well, I will install a tank that is associated with a certain volume of environmental benefit units, so that's our metric, and I would like $100 in order to do that. If I win, if I'm successful in that auction, I will be paid that $100. So you get paid what you bid if you're successful. But then there's also another type of auction called a uniform price auction, which is slightly different. And in a uniform price auction, everybody gets paid the same price. So even if I bid $100 for that tank, I might get paid more than that if I'm successful. And in fact, if I am successful, I'll get paid at least that $100. So these are the differences, the relative benefits of these types of auctions are something that auction theorists talk about endlessly. But for our purposes, what we thought was important is that households would be revealing to us their information truthfully. So they would be truthfully telling us what their actual costs of installing rain tanks were. So because of the properties of this uniform price auction, so where everybody gets paid the same price, we decided to go with that auction in the Little Stringybark Creek. So once we've decided on the auction format, but we need to then work out, well, how are households actually going to participate in this auction? What information are they going to tell us? And you can imagine that even on the one property, there are many, many options for a single household. They can install a single tank, they can install a rain barrel, they can install a rain garden, or they can install various combinations of those installations. And each of those will have different costs. So there's lots of different buckets that households could choose to bid on. So on slide 11, what we allowed households to do in the Little Stringybark Creek in Stormwater Tender Mark 1, so this is the first time we ran an auction in Little Stringybark Creek, is we allowed households to submit bids on lots of different packages of interventions. And so what we would just do is order those interventions in terms of the relative price. So on the schematic on slide 11, on the vertical axis you just have price, so that's dollars per unit of environmental benefit, which is just price. And then on the horizontal axis, you have those environmental benefit units or quantity. You can just see that those bids are ordered, are arranged in order of increasing quantity. So that households could submit multiple bids, and then what the way that the auction works is that we take all those bids, we order them in terms of price, and then we construct this supply schedule. So on slide 12, what I'm showing is the actual results of Stormwater Tender Mark 1. So this is the first time we ran an auction in the Little Stringybark Creek. So there's 3 curves on this diagram, and I want to focus on the aggregate supply curve. So that's the dashed line that's to the right of the other curves. So this aggregate supply curve, that is a combination of the supply both from households and also from streetscape scale projects. So using the supply curve, we can order the projects, all of the projects, both the streetscape and the private projects, in order of price. And then we can select out of all of those sets of projects what are the most cost-effective interventions to undertake. And you'll see that there's effectively a diamond, and that diamond is indicating the point at which the project's budget, so we had a fixed budget for this project, is actually exhausted. So that identifies the price per unit of environmental benefit that all households will receive in this auction. And then if we trace that line, the line that's the horizontal line that's attached to that diamond back to the private supply curve and the public supply curve, we'll identify which projects are successful in both the public sphere and the private sphere. So the idea behind this method is to say, well, we don't care whether projects are public or private. What we care about is the total benefit and spending our budget well. So let's pick the best projects out of the public and the private and fund those projects. So that uniform price auction has attractive properties. As I said earlier, it encourages households to be truthful about what are the costs to them of say, installing a rain tank. But what we noticed is that in this auction, there was potentially some misunderstanding on the part of participants. So although the uniform price auction in theory has these attractive properties, perhaps households didn't actually understand what their true incentives were in this mechanism. So on slide 13, what we're showing is potentially evidence that households were overbidding in this auction. So what happened was that we used this supply curve method to identify the uniform price. So on slide 13, that's represented by the solid line. And all of the points here are bids, particular bids from householders. And everybody who was below that, who had bidded below that price, was successful in the auction. What we then did was we went back to the unsuccessful bidders and said, well, hey, this is what other people are being paid. Would you accept this price for installing your tank? And so the diamonds, the triangles in that figure are instances where households said, yes, okay, well, that's not what I bid for, but I'm happy to accept that price. So the point of this figure is basically just to point to the fact that those households may have been overbidding, and so the auction mechanism may have been a bit too complex. So we learned from that, and we went on to implement Stormwater Tender Mark 2. So on slide 14, I'm just introducing, so this is a second auction that occurred after the first auction, and it's a slightly different format. So it's what's called an open ascending price auction. So the way that the auction works is outlined on slide 15. So the idea is that all households in the area who could participate in this auction are notified that it is going to start, and expressions of interest are sought. Then the project announces a price for environmental benefits units and asks households if they would like to participate. If we still have more budget than our allocated project, so anyone who says they would be willing to participate at that price, their project is funded. But if we still have leftover budget, then we offer a higher price. And that process continues until our budget is exhausted. And one of the keys in Stormwater Tender Mark 2 is that at every stage we're comparing the private projects as well as the public projects. So as that price rises, more and more public projects will also get funded, and that will use this same overall budget. So slide 16 is just an example of how that ascending price auction would work, but I might skip that and go to slide 17, which is actually the results of this ascending price auction. So you can see, once again, we've got the same or a similar vertical and horizontal axis. So I'm on slide 17. The vertical axis is, once again, the price. It's the amount of money per unit of environmental benefit, and the horizontal axis is that quantity of that benefit. So at a price of $1,000 per environmental benefit unit, we had, I think it's 36 units of environmental benefit supplied by households. And at that price, there were no public projects that could be funded. It was not sufficient. They were too expensive to be funded at that price. So we hadn't exhausted our budget at that point, so we increased the price to $1,500. More supply came on from households. Then we still hadn't exhausted our budget, so we increased the price to $1,600. And at that price, our public works start to become cost competitive. So at that price, then we start to also fund public projects. But we still haven't exhausted our budget, and so we continue to increase that price until finally our budget is exhausted. You can see that the volume of public environmental benefit units starts to dominate the volume of units that are coming from households. So we're basically starting to reach saturation point with those households quite early on. So slide 18 is just another set of supply curves so that you can compare this auction with the previous auction, so just showing you that the relative supply curves. And once again, you can see that the private supply gets exhausted relatively quickly. But for low prices, there's only private supply that is available. So on slide 19 is just a comparison of these two different mechanisms for procuring adoption from households in the Little Stringybark Creek. So one thing we would like to learn from this project is what is a better way to engage with households using an auction mechanism. And it seems like an open ascending price, which is the mechanism that was used in round 2, might have several advantages over the sealed bid or the first mechanism that was used. And why is that? Well, it seems like both the risk that the households are taking in having to formulate a bid or just make an opt-in, opt-out decision in the open ascending price is probably beneficial. So households can merely say, yes, that's a price I'm willing to accept, rather than having to actually come up with their own number. So on slide 20, there's just an attempt to compare the performance of these two different auction mechanisms. And it's a little bit difficult to do that because we've implemented an auction over the same territory. So this is not an ideal comparison of which kind of auction performed the best. But overall, we would say that round 2 certainly was able to procure more environmental benefit units. And that's not just because of stronger participation from public or streetscape scale projects, but it also seems like households were actually able to understand the process and participate in the process to a greater extent. So finally, on slide 21, there are a number of things that were not resolved by this project. One is that although we did consider, when we're allocating budget, we considered both private and public projects, what we didn't do is deal with coordination problems amongst those projects. So for example, if you implement a large streetscape scale project, the benefit of installing a tank right next door may be very, very low. So there's a coordination problem there. And then we are also implementing auctions over the same territory. So actually after these first 2 rounds of auctions, Little Stringybark Creek project moved much to offering households a fixed price for environmental benefit units. But that they wouldn't have done that without these auction mechanisms, first of all revealing, well, what are households willing to accept, what are the costs of households participating. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to obviously take questions if there are any.
It's great. Do we have some questions?
Yeah, and Andrea, this is Stan. I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was super interesting. Can you answer two questions? One is, what was the total budget that you were working with? And I recall that was coming from Melbourne Water, so it would be nice to know, if it was all coming from Melbourne Water, and how, how reproducible that would be both within Victoria and elsewhere. I guess that's the first question. And the second question, the saturation that you observed at 133 or 31 households in your second round, I'm just curious to unpack that a little bit more. Is that due to you sort of you got all the early adopters, or was that all of the houses that had the kind of environmental benefit scores that would have allowed this to work? Or anyway, if you could elaborate on those two, it'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. So actually, off the top of my head, I can't recall what the budget for the stormwater fund, so the round 2 was, but the budget for round 1, that auction, was $300,000. So out of that, I've got some numbers here. There were 71 rain barrels were installed and 7 rain gardens got installed, and these are all on allotments for households. So all of those interventions came from about 101 bids, so about 54 of those bids were actually successful. So that's for round 1. In terms of the saturation, I think my understanding, I've been less involved with the project as it's moved forward into just using a fixed price type mechanism, but given that they have had a lot more, they have continued to have adoption in the same area, I don't think it's a global saturation, if you like. I think it was saturation for this time and for this mechanism. So clearly households have a lot on their minds, they're doing a lot of things, and I think for that particular time we had reached saturation, but subsequent engagement was certainly successful. So there were still more people who were willing to adopt for that price.
Andrea, this is David. Go ahead, Stan.
No, I'm done. That was wonderful. Thank you.
So, Andrea, kind of a two-part question. One of the things embedded in your presentation, really terrific, is that there are certain benefits that are sort of synergistic. That, in other words, if you could introduce things in a certain predictable sequence from upstream to downstream in the watershed, presumably, you would get maximum benefit. And that also there's synergies not only in terms of the users or the adopters, but in terms of the sort of the sequence of innovations that might be adopted. I was wondering if you might maybe amplify that a little bit. What are some of your thoughts about looking forward and extending what's been learned in Little Stringybark to things that we need to keep in mind in terms of maximizing benefits, minimizing costs, and acquiring the best synergistic benefits possible?
So, I mean, I guess I'm best placed to answer that from a auction design perspective, I guess, rather than any other perspective. So it's a very challenging problem, and it's one that occurs in a lot of auction settings. So one thing that you could do when you have this ascending price auction type format is that you can continuously update your calculation of the relative environmental benefit of each project. So as you're going, when you reassess new bids, then you reassess them relative to the projects that you have already funded. So that's one way of doing it, but that's still not going to solve the kind of larger coordination problem, which is that of all the possible projects, we want the best set of those projects. So in part that comes from the design of the metric, and it could also come from, I guess, greater coordination amongst the bids. So if you had a system where households were able to make a series of different types of bids, and the auction mechanism could then select amongst all of those bids, including the streetscape project, the optimum allocation. But that type of auction system, so that's used in a lot of the US spectrum auctions.
Right.
In the US, it's not unique problems, but they're very complex, and it's not clear that the additional benefits that you would get are worth that kind of complex mechanism.
Thank you very much.
Not at all.
If no further questions, let's go on to our next speaker.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Andrea. We appreciate it. Our next speaker is Stephanie Hamill. She's going to be speaking about low-impact development maintenance. So, Stephanie, you can take it away. And it looks like you're muted, Stephanie.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we're good.
Awesome. All right. So I'm going to speak about low impact development maintenance in the context of the Yarra Ranges Council, where I work as a water sensitive urban design officer. And apologies if I use the word WUSID in my presentation rather than LID, which is the term that I'm a bit more familiar with. So in terms of the session plan, I'm going to speak remind us of with an overview and a different perspective than the previous presentation on the Little Stringybark Creek project, LSC project, and its collaboration with Yarra Ranges Council. I'm going to then talk about the maintenance milestone to give an overview and an understanding of the journey that we went through since the inception of the project. And I'm going to then speak about the maintenance arrangement, which are upcoming for the next financial year, 16-17. I'll then reflect on the past challenges that we've been able to address and the current ones that we're still remaining with and trying to address in the next couple of months, years. I will then talk about the successes and lessons learned from this journey. In terms of the Little Stringybark Creek project, and that's my slide number 3, Andrea touched on it. The overall research objective was to see whether it was possible to restore, using some stormwater retention measures, the Little Stringybark Creek, a degraded stream, in Mount Evelyn, Victoria. And so that led to the implementation of hundreds of water-sensitive urban design systems over the past 8 years, really, when the first one was put in the ground. As Andrea talked about in her presentation at the beginning, on private land, and then I'm going to focus a bit more on public land ones. The project has been recognized at the international level and invited to become a UNESCO International Hydrological Demonstration Project. And what I wanted just to highlight was the project structure. So Melbourne Water, the Water Authority, together with federal and state government funding the project, and the Melbourne University leading the planning and channeling the funding to different stakeholders, and in particular Yarra Ranges Council, who's looking at the implementation of the project, Storm Consulting, looking at helping out with the design, and Yarra Ranges Council, and that's of interest for our presentation, looking at, being responsible for maintenance, monitoring and evaluation, which in partnership with Melbourne University. On slide 4, in terms of the maintenance milestones, so 2008 is when I understand I was not involved in this process, but the first systems in the ground in terms of private on private land. 2010 is when the first systems on public land were put in the ground. 2011 is when the first written memorandum of understanding has happened between the Little Stringybark Creek team and the Yarra Ranges Council. It was a pretty simple agreement, but highlighting some of for the first time, the requirements and starting the conversation about the requirements for maintenance for this these systems with a bit more detail. And 2012 is the agreement is followed by some financial support from the LSC project team to council, in particular to maintain the gross pollutant traps, which are assets requiring more money because it is contracted out from our perspective. And so yeah, 2015 is when I joined. Basically, it's fair to say that the maintenance was and still happening on an ad hoc or reactive basis. But there's been a very interesting milestone for late last year in terms of retrofitting all the rain gardens from that were on public land with, and you can see the photos on the left-hand side here, where all the rock inlets, difficult to maintain for the teams, were replaced with this sediment tray, capturing all the sediments before they reach the filter media in the rain gardens. And that has led to facilitate all the maintenance. A maintenance proposal was then submitted from the Little Stringybark Creek team to Yarra Ranges end of 2015. And that has led to the situation that we are currently in and will be implementing in 2016, where a dedicated WSID item was added to the council's operational budget. And that means that there's a possibility of co-funding being signed while we speak between council and the LSC team for the next 3 years of a maintenance program. So that's where we're at. And I just want to moving to slide number 5, to explain what is this maintenance system that we are developing at the moment. So the big novelty is this WSID maintenance officer, which will be sitting in one of the 2 maintenance teams, the Parks and Bushland team. At Yarra Ranges Council, we've got the other part of the maintenance, the civil maintenance team. And this WSID maintenance officer will have work in close collaboration with the civil maintenance sitting through a system of requests that we can log. It's called the pathway request system. And it's sitting in a team of gardeners because of the set of skills which is necessary for their tasks. It will also be supported by the WSID officer from a training perspective when required, but also from a monitoring and reporting perspective. On the next slide, I just highlighted the schedule that we'll be working on with monthly activities and annual activities. So basically, in this 3 years arrangement, we're talking about maintenance of the assets 4 times a year minimum. That's the red ticks every 3 months, and an additional 4 times based on large rain events. There's also the annual activities by the end of our financial year with some monitoring, replanting because that's the right season, and annual reporting. I wanted to highlight on the next slide some of the maintenance constraints that have influenced the impact, or that have had an impact on the way we have designed, but also we have to maintain the systems. And the quite high slopes in the Dandenong areas is something that influences the way we have to manage the system with high velocities entering the systems. The gravel and roads and driveways are also something which is different from an urban environment, for example, or very urban environment, which means that we have to think carefully to that in our design and maintenance plan in terms of the treatment train for when we design WSID systems. And finally, in terms of tree and foliage also, this is something you can see on the bottom picture there, quite a large amount that we have to deal with, which can be low compared to urban systems, which might have a bit less of this issue. I'm moving on to the previous challenges that we've been able to address. So, and all these challenges have obviously in the context of our seminar slowed down the adoption of WSID from a maintenance perspective. So In terms of institutional challenges, the fact that WUSID sits across these two teams that I've described, the civil maintenance team on one side and the green maintenance on the other side, and it meant that we had to reconciliate the different ways of working. Pretty same council, but pretty different ways of working, and that's something that has inhibited, I think, some of the uptake. Just not knowing what the new structure would be, basically. There was also no dedicated WUSID resource, so in terms of people, but also budget. So any resource allocated to WUSID would be part of a drainage pool, basically, which means that it didn't focus in particular on trying to solve WUSID issues, and that has been identified as a challenge, hence this additional budget line now created and person. And what I wanted to highlight is the fact that it was not a WUSID-only issue. Based on the asset management plan that we have a picture here on the right-hand side, and done very recently, the insufficient budget for maintenance was an overall issue, and so it was really trying to address the bigger picture rather than trying to solve only the WUSID situation. Some other limiting factors on the next slide is, so from the Little Stringybark Creek project, I think it's fair to say there's been initial discontinued levels of ownership with, for example, different WUSID officers in the role over the years, but with interruptions in between. So letting the momentum created sort of drop off, and then these issues of maintenance which have been tackled, you know, in a continuous way, not being able to be addressed adequately. So that's one of the factors. The other one is for council's project, for example, some of the past projects have created this negative feedback loop, and that's what I'm explaining in the diagram below. So the a poor planning and or design and or construction of the systems has led to assets being hard to maintain, which in turn has been leading to a reduced appetite for WUSID, and that's where we can see the link between this maintenance issues and the adoption of WUSID more generally at council. On the left-hand side here, there's a few photos of a planning and design issue where the rain garden is straight after a big culvert, and basically the garden being washed out after every single rain, the water not being filtered at all and going straight in the traditional overflow and drainage pit system. The second one at the bottom with some construction issues where all the clay, or in a very clay environment, the material, the soil dug up from the filter media was just left on the side, on the batters, and this has led to a very unfavorable plant environment for the growth. In terms of current challenges, the remaining challenges that we have to address are the fact that we are pretty good at accessing some capital funding and works through grants. However, they're not associated with maintenance issues. So that's where we can see that, well, for the 3 next years, we're going to be able to cover these maintenance costs, but what's next? And that's something we have to be addressing. So successes and lessons learned on the next slide. From a structure point of view, we have found it useful to have a WUSID steering committee made out of, or composed with managers and executive officers, and a working group at a more operational level. So all of them being used at various stages of this journey to help answer some of these high-level questions or more operational level questions, and that's been working really well. Another is this role of the WUSID officer, which has created the link between the 2 maintenance teams, but also other teams like the construction one. And it initially was sitting in the environmental team, but was found to have a pretty interesting influence and impact in the infrastructure team. So in terms of processes, there's been some really interesting now review meetings and feedback process from the maintenance team at the design stage, and that has led to, as I was mentioning before, this retrofitting of all the rain gardens in an unsealed road environment. And also in terms of the batters, them not being planted, but rather planted with grass rather than vegetation, to diminish the maintenance needs and allow them to be mowed. So that's some of the maintenance feedback which we found quite useful. Finally, in terms of communication and risk management, we have had an increased level of details of the conversation about maintenance over the last few years, and that has led to this pretty detailed proposal that I was mentioning for the next 3 years, where we're able to identify some pretty specific schedules, but also like funding requirement for the next 3 years, and that's been a great outcome of this journey. The second one is the great effort which has been put on communicating evidence-based successes from the LSE project, and that's been invaluable for council to be able to use that and to address this negative perception that I was talking about from some of the past projects. That goes together with the risk which we've been able to address of not maintaining the assets, and that raised by several councillors. So putting this political pressure, I guess, has helped keeping the maintenance issue high on the agenda. And as a conclusion, just wanted to say that some of the past changes have definitely slowed down the adoption of WUSID in the Yarra Ranges. Some temporary arrangement has been found for the next 3 years with this co-funding with the Little Stringybark Creek project or team. And yeah, however, in terms of the long-term perspective, we still haven't found this sustainable model of funding. And we need to be doing that with all the stakeholders involved in waterways management in Victoria. So thank you. That's all for my presentation, and happy to answer a few questions.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions before our next speaker. Stephanie, any questions for Stephanie?
Yeah, hi, Stephanie. This is Brandon at UCLA. It's really interesting to hear about the maintenance, and I was particularly interested in the fact that you are now planting grass around those biofilters. I visited those a few times, and I'd noticed that they were pretty. They had a lot of varying conditions around the biofilters. I wondered inside the biofilters if vegetation that could be pruned or mowed or harvested was being considered for future biofilters, because we're kind of looking at the benefits of how harvesting can improve the biofilter performance. I wonder if you can comment on maybe some of the vegetation changes within the biofilters, if that's something that you're looking at.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's true that at the moment we actually have considered only the batters, just based on all this research done by the FOB in the FOB study, and the idea being that all these carex and other plants that we're putting in the biofilter have been proven in terms of their performance. However, I know there's a lot of research, and we'd be very keen to be part of that with other councils to develop what they're calling at the moment the ZAM WUSID, another acronym, so the Zero Additional Maintenance Water Sensitive Urban Design. And I think they were trialing some specific type of grass, which hopefully would have a similar performance than but I think at the moment we have been using the literature and using these Caris and Juncus and other plants which have been proven as efficient.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that, with the maintenance schedules, you don't have any maintenance to actually prune the plants within the biofilters, do you?
No, we do, sorry. It was a very quick summary of the tasks. The list is actually much longer. And we do, so not too much, but we are trying to keep it. It's from a performance, but also from an aesthetic point of view, communities keen to, and we have a team of gardeners looking at how that can be integrated as well as possible in the landscape, and so that's definitely a task that the WUSID maintenance officer will be undertaking.
Excellent. I'll know we'll have some more questions and opportunity for discussion during the roundtable session. Let's go ahead and move to our next speaker.
And our next speaker is Jian Peng from Orange County Public Works. He'll be speaking about a vision for low-impact development in Southern California. And Jian, you can go ahead and take it away.
So should I just share my desktop so everybody can see, or you can advance it?
You can just go, yeah, it looks like you already have it up, so you can go ahead and take it from there.
Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. The topic is that I think Stan assigned a very big topic for me, the vision of LID in Southern California. I can't say that I have a vision because, there's more of just my perspective because there's so many experts in the room. So I would say I want to talk about some general topics with a little bit focus on Orange County in Southern California. So we actually, I invited some friends from China. Some of them are having technical issues, but they promise they're going to actually watch the YouTube video later on. So we have a pretty good crowd. So next slide. Let's see. Okay, so this is the outline of the presentation. I want to talk about the limitations, cost, benefit, performance, different types of LID, in terms of new or retrofit or the infrastructure add-on. I think the previous speakers talked on some of the limitations, including maintenance and operations and things like that. So I will focus on a little bit higher level issues. So I'll try to, give my perspective. I also want to talk a little bit about LID and water quality, LID and water resource, again, with a little bit focus on Southern California, because I understand the issues here are probably different from the issues in Australia and issues from other parts of the U.S. or in China. So I'll give the focus on the Southern California, then a summary. So this slide, next slides, I think I mentioned it in the last presentation. So the message is that LID is not for everywhere because of the limitations in both natural conditions, things like topography, soil type, groundwater, or man-made issues like land use, soil, groundwater contamination, and things like that. So if we use the GIS-based approach to, this slides give an example for Newport Bay watershed, which is in central Orange County. So we did a GIS layer and analyzed the natural and anthropogenic information and overlay them and come up with the limitations for LID implementation. So figure H, which is at the center bottom of the slide, it shows if we overlay all the limitations, there are only very few places where we can actually implement LID because of the soil or land use or land ownership or groundwater issues. So this showed, when we actually think about LID implementation, especially for certain type of LID like infiltration, we need to consider all the facts. So this graph shows the entire Orange County, and using the same process that I described before, the red dots are pretty much the area where, after all the limitations are considered, these are the places where we could implement infiltration type of LID. So as you can see, very few places are actually amenable. I think Andrea talked about private, public cost, issues, land ownership issues. So these red dots are pretty much public-owned parcels. So because a lot of restrictions where we could implement LID, liability issues, cost issues, and things like that. So considering all of this, very few places we could actually implement LID. So let's see. Cost, of course, it's a part of the deal, because if we try to, going outside of the market factor, the cost for land acquisition, sometimes you have to consider it. You buy land to implement LID, which usually it means a lot of cost. The other cost could be, if you don't do LID, or you have some issues that could have been solved by implementing LID, and you don't do it, and you go out of compliance. The compliance penalty or compliance cost could play a role. So that's something that's think about. The red dot, which here I showed, is actually where UCI is. I want to put that one in is because UCI and some other places are recently added into the phase 2 stormwater permit. We actually invited the environmental manager for UC Irvine to our campus to share our experience and our perspective how to achieve stormwater compliance and LID. I think for UCI folks, they are actually doing pretty well. There are quite a few sites on campus, and I'm sure Stan knows some of them. So next slide. For LID, I mentioned LID has many limitations, including climate. So this picture showed the Millennium Park in Chicago. I'm actually going to visit Chicago in August, so I'll take a note. I'm going to visit Millennium Park. I think Chicago stands out in terms of the implementation of LID, especially green roof. And this one is a good example of green roof. Obviously, green roof is something that in Southern California we have considered. Even for the project right outside of my office, we are actually, as I speak, there are folks outside working for an LID project. And for this project, we thought about green roof, but because of many reasons, including the precipitation pattern, temperature, or the irrigation needs, just because of the climate condition in Southern California, it actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to implement green roof because of the structural need, cost, and the need for a lot of irrigation when there is no rain, which is very rare in Southern California. So that's one of the reasons. I'm going to talk about other reasons later on. And we also need to think about the other natural factors for green roof or other LIDs. Other than the climate, there could be substrate, like Toronto. They have a substrate or subsoil that's pretty much produced by glacier activities, and in winter the frozen soil gonna cause a lot of issues for infiltration type of LIDs. So next one is just to show you the case study in Houston. This one actually was taken a few days ago by a drone. As many of you know, that they are actually experiencing a historic flood, and many people actually died. So this one is a park that is built on top of Buffalo Bayou, which runs through the city. And interestingly, I was there last year when I was attending the LID International Conference. And this location was where I took a friend of mine from China took a picture of mine, and you can see it was dry, and the river actually was to my left, way out there. And in the flood, it's just overtopped the whole bayou and flooded a very large area of the city. I think the lesson from this picture is that for Houston, because of the specific soil type, which is has very poor infiltration ability, infiltration rate, the ability to implement infiltration type of LID is very limited. That's one of the reasons why it's when the storm is huge, they have issues dealing with that. And I think for cities like Houston, probably they need to focus a little bit more on harvesting and other infrastructure. But on the other hand, I think all the LID implementation need to consider the size of the storm, because LID can't fix everything. You have to have other type of infrastructure in place to make it work. And next slide, it shows the multiple benefits for LID. I think everybody is pretty well aware of, so I'm not going to go into details. And the next one is just a graphics that prepared by our consultants when they helped me design our campus LID project, and different type of LID and their performance in terms of water quality improvements are shown. I think the data is mostly based on the international BMP database, where for different type of pollutants, the average performance was shown here, and that's actually how we came up with the 95% of the load reduction, because our project is gonna keep 85% of the runoff from the site, and out of the 15 remaining % of the runoff, we're gonna remove about 2/3 of the pollution. As you can see, look at most of the BMPs or LIDs can remove from about 50 to 75% of the pollution load, and that's how I come up with 5% remaining discharge of pollutant, so 95% removal. And next slide is the cost consideration for the LID implementation. This also was prepared by our consultant for different options. As you can see, I mentioned earlier, when we consider green roof, which could look pretty good, but again, the cost is very high compared to all the other options. Pervious paving, it is expensive, but it looks good. But also, we need parking spaces where we have to have a way of not only accommodating the LID project, but also practical consideration. That's why we have permeable paving. We have all the other different LID type as well. So the message for this one is that for LID, cost is a very important consideration. Even though overall our performance cost effectiveness is not that great, because we want to use our project site to be a foundation for a base for research, public education, and demonstration. So, but cost, I think for everybody, I think Andrea and Stephanie talked about it. Cost is a big concern. So next slides, I want to just mention different approaches to LID implementation. When we talk about using LID for improving the water quality or water resource, things like that, there are different options. One could be new construction. If we have a new community to build, or just one single building, either through regulation requirement or through the, if the landowner has a, conscious, conscience about environment, he or she might be interested in putting in LID. It could be distributed, for every parcel or centralized. A community could choose to build a stormwater basin or multi-benefit basin, like one of the basins in southern Orange County that I think it has a long name. I forgot the name, but it's one of the multi-benefit BMPs that we built. It could also be, for LID, it could also be retrofit, where, just like our building, this is a retrofit LID project where we actually wanted to just refresh the parking surface. We have 3 parcels. The concrete are all cracked up and it looked really bad. And we wanted to put some money to improve the driveway and parking spot. And, here's the opportunity to get some money to put in some LIDs. That's what we did. So the retrofit is a very important mechanism for implementing LIDs in Southern California, I think in other places as well. There are also, regional LID BMPs, things like if we, for example, on this graph, the lower left is actually a pretty good example of regional LID project. It's called Sponge City. It's in Jinhua City in Zhejiang, China. So this one, the whole city block, which actually is an island in a river, in a lake, the whole block was completely redone and redesigned and put in all kinds of LID features in it, and it is one of the banner projects in China. So pretty impressive. Or it could be the entire city, like Kigali, which is a city in Rwanda. They have this master plan where they're gonna achieve water and energy neutral big city. That's a very aggressive plan. But if we have a bare land to develop a new city from ground up, it's entirely possible. Later on we have actually, we do have an example in city of Irvine, which from the LID maybe not so much, but it is one of the probably first ever city with a master plan. And UC Irvine should be very proud of itself, because UC Irvine is one of the first pieces in this master plan. And the designer, which Pereira, I think, he actually said back in 1963 that in recent years, we here in California have become rather expert at abusing our land and our resources. Here we have a tremendous opportunity to point people's taste and expectations in another direction, and we can do it. The sheer size of the place make it almost anything possible. So this was 40, 50 years ago, and forward thinkers like Pereira could think about it. So I think we could actually learn from him as well. The last one, I think Stan actually and I actually are working on this. This is an interesting idea, which is MS5. Here in United States, we call the storm drain system MS4 because it's a municipal separate storm drain system, MS4. But Stan is thinking about making it smart. So with smart, it becomes MS5, where we could use the flood control system and add some intelligent system like computer-controlled valves to use the MS4 system to store water and link it to other systems, including LID, so that we can make better use of captured floodwater. So a lot of different new ideas. Next slide is about the LID and water quality. I think, when we talk about LID implementation, for people like me, which, who I work mostly on water quality issues. So this is a big deal for us. What we want to do is using LID and features like biofilters to remove the pollutant from the stormwater. So, usually this is implemented through stormwater permit, and every permit has about 5-year cycle. So the thought is, after a few permit cycles, we try to achieve the water quality goal usually set up by TMDL, or total maximum daily loads. And the main graph looks like what is shown here. It is made by City of LA for its stormwater permit. And in Southern California, we have 3 major counties: Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego. So we call the plans to achieve water quality compliance different names. For Los Angeles, it's called Enhanced Watershed Management Plan, and for San Diego to our south, it's called Water Quality Improvement Plan. And for us, we don't actually have a name yet, but it's some kind of reasonable assurance analysis. So pretty much how we actually can reasonably reach the target for water quality. So we're still working on it, but we also understand there is a huge cost. For Los Angeles, it's about $50 billion. For San Diego, it's about 10. Orange County, we don't know yet, but I'm guessing. Don't quote me on this, because these are just a pretty rough estimate. But for Orange County, it's 5 billion or so. It could change depending on the regulatory requirements and things like that. So just to give you a scale of things, this is not just for water quality, probably for water resources and other infrastructure as well. So a lot of investment for this. Next slide is just in terms of water supply. We talked about water quality. Water supply is also a big issue for Orange County. The center one is pretty much how we try to meet the drinking water demands. So you can see there are all kinds of different sources, including imported water from Northern California, the non-potable recycled water from the left. Underneath, water use efficiency, something like we use tiered pricing or things like that to encourage people to use water more efficiently. Could also be, things like how we can improve managing the groundwater basin. That includes the Santa Ana River base flow. We're talking about the upper right side of the screen. So we Orange County Water District actually actively infiltrate the base flow from Santa Ana River to replenish the groundwater basin. Then, for storm flows, there are dams to keep them in the storm and release it very carefully after the storm, so that the water can actually infiltrate into the ground. I think in the last few years, all the water, every single drop of stormwater has been managed like that. So it's pretty impressive. So for things like LID, it's a little bit discouraging, but you can see that LID actually is somehow related to this incidental percolation when we talk about water resource. So, until now, it is a very small portion of the groundwater replenishment in terms of how the Orange County's groundwater basin is managed. So what we should do actually is try to maximize the incidental percolation, so that the groundwater and drinking water source can be better protected. I don't think we can solve the problem by doing more LID and increase the percolation, but we can help. So next slide. Well, I think I'm trying to summarize the what my thought is in terms of LID implementation. I think, you know, as I mentioned, LID implementation is subject to many constraints. Could be natural, could be ownership, could be cost, could be regulations. It also, you know, has many benefits. We try to leverage and maximize it. You know, we could do by holistic watershed approach. You know, I didn't mention that, you know, for all the different counties, their plans actually are more or less based on models. So we try to model the, you know, the implementation at different places and see how the watershed respond. Of course, we need to be adaptive because I think LID is still a growing science. You know, we need to just feel our way through implementing the LID at a wider scale based on the lessons we have learned. We also probably want to integrate LID in infrastructure planning because infrastructure now for the built environment, it's a huge, you know, elephant in the room. You know, it's very hard to, you know, use LID implementation to impact infrastructure because, you know, I think it's much easier to actually incorporate the LID elements in the infrastructure planning and implementation so that the impact from the new development could be minimized and the new infrastructure can actually mitigate the impact by the existing infrastructure. So there are a lot of planning to do, and this is actually our thoughts when we work with you know, the folks from San Diego, because they are dealing with this on a pretty you know, high level and larger scale when they deal with try to deal with their permit compliance. I think Stephanie did a very good job in terms of operations and maintenance. Yeah, it is a very big issue. You know, if we don't maintain the LID we put in the ground, it's not going to work. This is some of the things that we try to test out in our campus project as well. It's interesting, you know, when everybody is happy when the project gets funding, but when we talk about operations and maintenance, you know, people start to back away. So it'll be interesting to see. So last slides, I'm actually done, but I just want to show you the concept of LID in China. It's called sponge city. It's a term coined by the president of China because, you know, he's not a scientist, but when he you know, think about the water resilient city, because there are major flooding issues for most of the major cities in China, and he was like, why not, you know, build cities like a sponge, so we can, you know, they can absorb water when it rains and things like that. So, but I think some of us will actually go to China this late June, early July. We'll see how they implement their LID, and probably we can get some ideas how we can learn from each other. So now, with that, I'm open for questions.
Any questions for John? One or two before we move on?
Maybe actually this is a question for both you, Jian, and also Stephanie about the maintenance. So I think both of your perspectives are maybe more focused on the government projects and maintenance of the larger scale installations. I'm just wondering, you know, what the thought is about maintenance of the distributed systems at the allotment or household scales.
Wow, you know, I think that's a question that probably Scott can provide some you know, feedback. I think this is we just had a very good example at City of LA, Los Angeles. You know, I think we all heard about the project for the Elmer Street. I think right now they are experiencing some operations maintenance issue because the I think the initial understanding was that the homeowner or homeowner associations were responsible for maintenance, but I think it fell through. If you go to Elmer Street right now, I think it's not in a very good condition. So in terms of operations maintenance for the private land or private parcel, I don't know. There has to be an agreement put in place, before the LID is put in the ground. Otherwise, without proper maintenance, it's just almost like a waste of money.
Sorry, Stanley. Do you mind just? I'm not sure to have gathered in terms of you saying like the private versus public, or the larger infrastructure compared to the small nature strip ones.
Yeah, Stephanie, based on what I understand of your talk, when you were talking about maintenance, you were really talking about the projects which are larger scale and owned by the local shires or governments.
Yes.
And I know from Andrea's talk that there were quite a few of these projects which were built at the household scale, and I'm just wondering if those are on your radar, or who is responsible for making sure that they don't go off the rails?
Yeah, like very good point. So that's part of the conversation which has been evolving, I guess, where it was very much in council's mind, at least, what was on private system, we were not going to go there, sort of aligned in terms of maintenance. And so aligned with what council would back away from for any other infrastructure. We're not building on private property because of access issues, and because of being able to run our maintenance schedule as we do on public land. However, and so at the moment on the LSC project, it's actually on a case-by-case basis. Gathered a few colleagues to go and help the LSC team, but that's really led by them. It wouldn't be something that that we would do normally. And so the idea and the assumption is that private owners would look after the system on private land.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, both for you, John, and also Stephanie. Your presentations referred to oversight, governance. Stephanie, you referred to a working group, an oversight working group to try to coordinate efforts. And John, your presentation, one of the last slides talked about a water advisory group in Orange County. From at least the standpoint of getting various participants in the process to work together in terms of common objectives, is that what these bodies are about? I know they're different, but I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Water Advisory Committee, it's almost like a discussion group where it's not a very formal committee with political power, but in terms of the how the water situation is handled in Orange County, there are just way too many pieces for me to list them. So in this committee, I think it's mostly for informational, and these are an excellent platform where I got a lot of information from that helped me understand the situation in Orange County. One of the issue actually related to the topic we have today is that I wish there is a incentive program similar to what Andrea talked about. Even though Orange County Water District did pay for some of the diversion projects where we actually supply diverted water for reuse, so they are the benefit. They receive the benefit of the recycled water, and they actually pay money for it. I think ideally, this is a topic that I hopefully, I can bring up later on in the future to the committee. That, if we, as a county or other agencies, can promote the implementation of LID, Orange County Water District can actually incentivize the the practice because they charge money for people who pump the groundwater, and whatever activities that could supply the groundwater aquifer, they benefit from it. So I just need to, think about how we can put this into the money term.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, did you want to comment at all on the oversight working group?
Yeah, so these were put in place a year or so ago, and to respond to various issues. So at the technical issue, I've talked about some of the mistakes and lessons learned that we were able to learn and sort of use this group to disseminate these lessons learned. It's a very practical level, but the steering committee is what we've used as a conduit to continue the discussion, which required a high level of decision making, such as this maintenance issue, which was known by all, but was not able to be addressed if these people able to make the decision were not involved. So that worked out well to continue leading the discussion and bring and keep the agenda, I guess, the maintenance on the agenda. What it is at the moment, it's purely internal, and what we'd like to see it because of these remaining challenges that we have in terms of funding cycle is to potentially use some of the members of the steering committee to go outside and to discuss with water authorities. So that's the next conversation, but using the same group, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's go ahead and go to our last presenter. Scott?
All right, thanks a lot. My talk is called As the Industry Matures, Some Questions for LID. And I think it's pretty clear that LID is being mandated very widely in the U.S. through NPDES permits and certainly in California. And the vision is ultimately really a complete retrofit of LID in the urban environment. So moving forward, I think there's still some significant policy issues that we need to explore. So over on slide 2, one of the first ones that I wanted to bring up was groundwater contamination. I think there's been quite a few studies that show that soil is an excellent filter and also sorbs a lot of the pollutants in urban stormwater, but the stark reality remains that we still have groundwater contamination. And I think part of our issue is that we don't know what we don't know. The Chemical Abstract Society has indexed over 23 million commercially and 23 million chemicals or chemical compounds, and about 7 million of those 23 are in commercial use. So do we know everything that's going into groundwater through the various sources and pathways? Probably not. And I think it's also very clear that groundwater contamination is extremely difficult and expensive to remediate once it happens. It's a little bit like the oil pressure light in your car. Once it goes on, you've done a lot of damage. So I think it's really incumbent on us to be very protective of our groundwater resources. I think that groundwater protections in our current NPDES permits with the Class 5 injection well system and things are likely protective enough at the current scale of implementation. But given that we're going to be having such widespread implementation of LID in the urban environment, I think it warrants another look. You know, the highly soluble contaminants like salts, nitrates, other urban contaminants like VOCs, insecticides, pesticides. You know, we're seeing personal care products and pharmaceuticals showing up in wastewater effluents. I think are all maybe problematic for a future where we have very large-scale implementation of LID. So over on the next slide, kind of another interesting issue, which is low impact development and hydrologic balance. You know, I pulled the definition of LID off of Wikipedia, and you can see I highlighted there that it's one of the goals is to replicate the pre-development hydrologic regime of watersheds through infiltrating, filtering, storing, and evaporating. But what I think, you know, one of the things we've missed, and over on the next slide you can see it, this is kind of a classic, these pop up in most LID talks, you know, where you can see in an undeveloped watershed you have about 40% evapotranspiration and maybe 50% shallow and deep infiltration. And then when you go down to a highly urbanized watershed over on the lower right there, you can see, you know, with high impervious surfaces, you're down to roughly 15% shallow infiltration and much higher runoff. But over on the next slide, slide 5, you can see that there's still a few issues here. The first one is that the design storm that we're using to size LID control measures in a lot of the U.S. really wasn't developed to replicate pre-project hydrologic regime. It was more of an economics-based, you know, what is practical to store and treat on an economic basis. And there was also a really interesting study recently completed over at, I believe it was at the University of Minnesota by Erickson in the Vermilion River watershed that showed that urbanization, irrespective of LID on its own, was slightly increasing the interflow and shallow groundwater recharge rate as opposed to decreasing it. And I think this is something that's been overlooked in kind of the hydrologic balance as applied to urbanization. Some of the sources of this increase that they found were the sewer systems. You know, there's about roughly somewhere between 10 and 15% of water in the sewer system exfiltrates through the pipe joints. And so that's one of the source. Water systems, which are pressurized, actually tend to have an even higher loss. According to the Department of Water Resources, somewhere between 10 and up to 30% of water transmitted through domestic water systems is lost through leakage. And then, of course, we're all familiar with irrigation, particularly in Southern California, for example. We put as much as an inch per week of irrigation on a lot of our yards and areas. And lastly, septic systems. Those are obviously designed to exfiltrate water from 100 to, or from about 50 to 100 gallons per capita a day. So we have this huge or relatively massive infiltration of water going on in the urbanized area, and then we will be increasing that again with low impact development. So over on slide 6, just kind of putting out the question there and postulating that, you know, what is the net result of this change? Ultimately, we're going to see maybe higher interflow rates, higher base flows in urban creeks and streams, rising groundwater with its potential implications that it has on the built environment and existing structures. And what is the quality of this water? Is it appropriate for recharge? I think that, you know, potable water discharge from leaking potable systems probably isn't too bad, but the rest of them, you know, the leaking sanitary sewers, septic, and then the effluent even from LID, is the quality of this water going to be something that we want to be on a massive scale in urban areas recharging the groundwater table with? So I think it's appropriate for, you know, additional studies needed to take a look at really water balance in the urban environment and determine if some of these issues are going to have some negative unanticipated effects before, you know, we get to this relatively large scale of LID retrofit in the urban areas. So over on slide 7, another thing to consider is how to pay for this all. I think Jian did a great job of showing what the costs are, the estimated costs in the 3 major Southern California LID counties. You saw there, roughly I think 35 billion in expected costs, or 30 billion between the 3 counties. Not something that would be easily accommodated in any municipal budget. So another potential issue here is that we have this massive price tag, but the reasonable assurance analysis that Jian was talking about, which are essentially modeling exercises using unsteady flow models and fate and transport models, are showing that we're not necessarily coming into full compliance with receiving water standards for all pollutants, even if we have full retrofit of LID. So, what is our really end game here? What's the best way to fund LID retrofits with this $30 billion price tag in Southern California alone? I think one of the real questions that needs to be answered is, and it's not necessarily a technical question, but it's a social question, is what is the acceptable timescale to implement full LID retrofit? I think that environmental groups are looking at much shorter time frames than maybe the municipalities are when you're starting to look at cash flow diagrams and how quickly some of this can really occur. And then also something Jian mentioned too, I think is important, is what is the maintenance cost of these systems and how are we going to pay to maintain them? Certainly the present worth of the maintenance cost is much higher than the capital cost. And how do you maintain things that are on private development? We're starting to struggle with that right now, and most people are looking at some sort of maintenance districts, something that you can assure maintenance on, because as Jian pointed out, if you don't have assured maintenance over time, the systems will fail. And I think the general wisdom is that you can't count on private property owners without some sort of policing to carry out this maintenance. So a major question and a major element that we really haven't figured out in terms of how we're going to pay for this, and more importantly, pay for the maintenance. So over on slide 8, I just have some maybe potential solutions, some study ideas for some of these questions. Jian also brought up multi-benefit projects. I think this is one idea and one way to pay for LID retrofit. If you can show the public that you get multiple benefits for some of these installations, such as improving flood resiliency and improving the aesthetics of the built environment. I think we've done a fine job in most urban areas of just taking water out of the environment, and it's placed a very low value, I think, on water in the public's mind because it's out of sight and out of mind. It's usually very cheap in most cities. So helping to change how the public views and values water through multi-benefit type projects, which could be, green streets and streetscapes that have transit improvements and active transportation improvements, along with bringing water back into the built environment and showing the value and improving water quality in urban settings, I think will be important. Because if we're going to obtain new funding sources for LID and LID retrofit, that's going to come from the public. And if the public isn't valuing water at a different scale than they are today, they simply are not going to pay for the huge, huge price tag that we face. In terms of groundwater contamination, I'm a big advocate of what we call true source control. This is something that we have an initiative for at the California Stormwater Quality Associations. Really, when you look at LID from a certain perspective, it's really just a transfer of surface water pollutants into either the soil or the groundwater. It's not really a treatment for a lot of different pollutants per se. So we need to use true source control, and really that involves either substitution of problematic pollutants and chemicals, or the use of green chemistry principles, which I think we really haven't promoted well in the U.S. and really haven't promoted innovation in the green chemistry sector. And I think it's really where the highest return on investment is going to be for us in terms of surface water and groundwater pollution remediation. The Toxic Substances Control Act, which was passed in 1976, is currently, there's an update to that underway right now, and green chemistry really needs to factor into this discussion in a major way. Over on slide 9, in terms of hydrologic balance, you know, some study areas there. California uses about 20% of its total energy to move water within the state, and this massive importation and exportation of water from different portions in our different geographic areas in our state changes dramatically the hydrologic balance. So what I think we need to move towards is using and reusing water locally. Some examples of that are like the San Diego Pure Water Program, which is really a direct potable reuse of wastewater. We've already talked about some of the others on this seminar. Stormwater harvesting, native plant landscaping is huge. You know, I think in the U.S. we kind of put what plants where we want, when we want, and then just irrigate. And I think that there has to be a paradigm shift there. Gray water use is certainly another technology that needs to be exploited much more. And I think ultimately water needs to be used and reused locally. So, and the smaller scale that we can get on that, the better. So, for example, if we have household recycling systems for both gray water and black water, and trying to reuse water again at the smallest scale possible, I think that that's going to reduce the need for water imports and also reduce water pollution that accompanies those things. So in summary, my last slide over here on slide 10 is that, you know, again, the basic implementation of LID at the engineering level really right now doesn't support this premise of maintaining a hydrologic balance, and we need to, I think, reimagine some of the basic design principles if we're going to achieve that. And just this idea that whole-scale improvement of water quality isn't going to be achieved at the end of the pipe. You know, it's really kind of a fool's errand to think that we can strain a lot of these pollutants out at the end of pipe at really what are nanogram per liter levels. We really need to start looking at true source control and green chemistry for a lot more of our innovation in terms of pollution reductions. And money, lots of money is going to be needed, and the public must support this. So we need to tell a much better story in terms of what the benefits are, and I think multi-benefit projects are one element of that if we're going to get the money we need to get the ball down the field in a measurable way. And so clearly articulating the benefits and, again, changing how the public views and values water, I think, is going to be critical to the future if we're going to be able to innovate the way that we need to and make the decisions that have to be made and fund those in a way that's going to achieve measurable benefit in a time scale that meets collectively everybody's expectations. So that's what I had, and happy to take any questions if there are any.
Before we move to our roundtable, let me ask if there are any clarification questions or other questions for Scott.
I have one quick question. You know, probably Stan can help as well, because you know, I'm a little surprised about the finding by Erickson et al. You know, in Minnesota, or you know, that's where he's from. You know, why urbanization could increase the inflow? That's a little bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is. I was really surprised. I'll send you that paper, John, that that they put together. And obviously, it was one study done in one watershed, but I think it has a lot of application, because in urban areas, you know, we all have separate or combined or separate sewer systems. We all have domestic water systems. there are some septic systems, and there's quite a widespread dependence on landscape irrigation as well. So I think it's just been an overlooked piece of the equation up till now, and something that deserves a lot more study.
Yeah, they must have a very, very leaky infrastructure. Otherwise, it's hard to imagine.
Yeah, well, I think you'll find that that's not all that uncommon. Most of the water systems and sewer systems are quite old in most of the country.
I was just going to add that that I think this is a very much a watershed by watershed issue. And if you look at the literature, there are definitely examples where as a community urbanizes, base flow in streams, for example, increases, and that's actually true in Southern California. We've had massive increases in base flow, 100%. I think the LA River was 500% over the last 100 years. Most of that is actually coming ultimately from water importation and then making it to the streams, usually in the form of sewage effluent, but in some cases you can also get, increased groundwater. But I guess I was going to ask a question, Scott, pertaining to it sort of as a theme that is in your talk, but it's something I hear a lot, and I find it a bit mystifying, I guess, and that is this almost making synonymous LID to infiltration. We published this ES&T paper last year, which basically pointed that from the hydrologic balance perspective that most urban areas would actually need to harvest more water than they infiltrated, as just a sort of blanket statement. Obviously, there's a lot of detail there, but I do encounter this a lot whenever the word LID is uttered. The first thought that comes to mind is infiltration, and then all the barriers to infiltration, including permeability and groundwater contamination and so forth and so on, when really a lot of the co-benefits could come from harvesting locally and using for fit-for-purpose activities. I was curious to get your feed on that. I mean, obviously you had at the end that harvesting was something that could be implemented, but is part of getting the public acceptance kind of changing the dialogue and the way that we even talk about these systems to some extent?
No, I'll admit that my bias is from Southern California. We've done a lot of studies looking at the economics of harvest in our area, and I think we have a lot to learn from probably Australia still. But the issue is storage. To have any meaningful benefit from storing stormwater in Southern California, you need massive, massive amounts of storage, and we simply don't have it. Groundwater storage is the best and cheapest alternative by far, and so that means, infiltration and making sure that we're infiltrating water of high quality. But, we look at rain barrels and any sort of storage on lot, at the on lot level, and it's really the cost benefit is just so far out of whack that it really doesn't make a lot of sense right now.
One other question, then, just to kind of get your reaction. I heard about this from somebody in LA who was talking about maybe using the storm sewer system as a storage device, just as a kind of offhand comment. And then, John mentioned the MS5, and that's actually something that we're actively thinking about is how you could potentially actuate the storm sewer system after a storm to actually use it as a storage, because it is a very massive system that is mostly dry most of the time. Has this thought or idea percolated to your consciousness, and do you have any comments on it?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. You're right, there is a significant amount of storage in the existing storm drain system, and it would take some infrastructure work. I think that the biggest issue would be public safety and making sure that could be drawn down and used before another storm hit. But also, you guys had talked about the last 5 and using, I think, real-time controls for the flood infrastructure, and I think that technology could really go a long way in helping to do that, both in our surface water storage reservoirs, our flood control basins that we have right now, which again are all dry, as you point out, as well as the underground systems. I think that having real-time controls and operating those as a smart network could definitely go a long way for stormwater harvest, and it's something that I think is a really, really good idea, because it appeals to me because we're getting more performance out of an existing infrastructure element, and I think that if we're going to be spending the public's money wisely, that's definitely one of the things that we need to look for. Absolutely.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that, and I would look forward to including you in that ongoing discussion then.
Absolutely.
I want to thank everyone for their patience. I know this has gone on a long afternoon and morning for our friends in Melbourne, but this has been incredibly interesting. I wanted to raise a kind of an out-of-the-box question for everyone and anyone to react to, but before I do, I wanted to note that there seem to be a number of really common themes in these presentations. One is the need to assess the multiple benefits of LID, as well as being able to attribute their various costs as accurately as possible. That's one. Secondly is this notion of the centrality of maintenance as being as important as operation in evaluating, assessing, implementing LID. And then this was particularly, Scott, you alluded to this, but I think John and the other presenters as well, there are known unknowns, but there are also a lot of unknown unknowns that still need to be somehow encompassed moving forward. So my out-of-the-box question, as I listen to all of these presentations, including my own, I guess, is looking to the future. Are we asking the same questions regarding non-LID alternatives that we are now asking of LID? And if we were asking these questions of all water management options, what might change in the future as we move ahead to consider some mix, some hybrid between LID options and non-LID options? And please, any way you want to react or answer that.
Well, I'll take a first shot. I think from a pollutant level, we are asking the same questions, really. We've been struggling since the Clean Water Act was first enacted in the 70s of how to remove pollutants from surface water, and the volumes are just so massive that treatment is really kind of a bankrupt idea. So, again, one of my dogmas is trying to move to source control and making sure that we don't allow pollutants to come in contact with surface water to begin with. And I think that ultimately that's going to be where we get most traction and most return on investment, and it's something that is continually overlooked and underfunded in the U.S. For sure, and it's something that I think that the dialogue needs to change on significantly.
Yeah, I think for me is, can you hear me? Sorry, I'm not sure I'm mute on mute.
Coming through fine.
Great. So I think what I just wanted to add is this need to focus on not only LID. LID won't solve all the issues, and we've talked a lot about that during the presentation. So putting it in the the overall integrated water resource management plan, and in particular, one of the things we've noticed in the Ranges Council, infiltrating has its limitation in our clay environment. Space constraints are an issue in terms of storage for harvesting, but also just the demand for this stormwater reuse is quite low in many respects, and so that's one of the other focus. If we want stormwater harvesting to actually have any impact on the creeks, we need to be using this water, and that's that's some other focus that we need to take into account. So it won't come from one magical thing, but just the LID in the middle of other options and incentives.
I would say I think Scott and Stephanie both made very good points. In terms of the source control, definitely from the environmental management point of view, this is a big deal for us because we're the MS force. We're responsible for a lot of environmental issues, but we could safely say that it traces back to everybody. So public education and behavior change really it means a lot for us, and we can see that some of the effort we're making have started to make a difference in terms of people's idea and hopefully in the behavior as well. I think in the long run it's gonna make a difference. In terms of the infrastructure, I would say a lot of the issues we are faced with right now and we try to solve with LID is because of the the built environment, how it was originally thought and planned and built, and that's the cause of the issues. And I'm thinking from a larger scale, just in a longer period, far into the future, when this infrastructure is up for retrofitting or upgrading, there are opportunities to actually make them stormwater sensitive in both water quality and water resource. Not necessarily LID, but I'm sure it'll be more sustainable and more intelligent. So because right now, because of the regulation requirement, the new development, they are largely pretty green. So I can see that the trend that's going to happen in the future. I also agree with Stephanie. We probably need to focus a little bit more on harvesting. I think that's Stan's idea as well. We can't just lock ourselves in the infiltration because that's just a part of the picture.
I would jump in and say in response to David's questions about sort of using the same kind of critical lens to judge non-LID as we seem to do for LID, that one wouldn't have to look too much farther than the desal plant, which is being proposed in Huntington Beach, and start asking really tough questions about that in terms of the legacy of it as well as the environmental wisdom of it. But I think one of the big differences between a desal plant and LID, in addition to scale, I mean, in terms of cost, maybe they're similar, right? $1 billion here or $1 billion there, is that there's a very clear market for the water that's produced from the desal plant. Whereas I think, as Stephanie alluded to, we have more of a problem with the water produced from LID. That even in enlightened places like Australia or Victoria, where stream ecologists have through force of personality more than anything, I think, resulted in these marvelous projects. In the end, maybe the real problem is that there's not as much of a need or demand for that low quality water, and unless that's resolved, I think that we're going to continue to see desal plants being built.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, which is the notion, and this is something that was mentioned in, I think, all of the talks in one way or the other. It seems as if older approaches to water management were very much based on large, centralized infrastructural projects to, as you alluded to, Stan, provide large amounts of water in large regions. And one of the interesting things about LID is it really does sort of deconstruct or sort of decentralize almost intrinsically the potential for addressing water resource problems in the urban setting in particular in a different way. And I'm wondering to what extent we're doing enough in terms of getting the public or publics to understand that maybe we need to turn the argument around from simply water supply or the pockets of water supply and water quality, as we've tended to treat them separately in the United States, to one of water resilience. And maybe that conversation somehow needs to get more insinuated into these discussions. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, like I talked about, I just don't think in the United States that we value water correctly. It's extremely cheap. You know, I put a couple rain barrels on my house, and I calculated that I saved like 5 rain barrels in a season, and it came out to about 10 cents in terms of the cost of the water that I saved. And people just, it's too cheap, and it isn't valued correctly. So again, I think bringing that back into cities and showing the value of water and starting to talk about the true costs of water. You know, water is highly subsidized. Here we are moving water in California from northern to southern California, massive amounts of energy, but we don't include the environmental benefits that are occurring, you know, from that wholesale transfer of water. So, and you're right also, it's a very non-resilient system, right? If we had a couple of those huge canals fail, we would be in trouble in Southern California. So we've built these massive storage projects down here to account for that. All those problems would go away, again, if water was used and reused locally. I think resilience of the infrastructure would increase, and the environmental disbenefits would certainly decrease. So I think that is a sort of a difficult concept maybe to put out to the public, but I agree with you that it's one whose time has come, because we've been ignoring it up till now completely.
Okay. Stephanie?
Yeah, well, I think the Little Stringybark project has come with this very decentralized and like perspective, and with the idea of well, with huge efforts at the beginning. We've heard from Andrea's presentation on getting private owners taken in the whole system in this LID here, WISID system. So I think and it has proven successful to a certain extent. So I think from the council's perspective, we see the value in definitely bringing this conversation with any new system to give the put in the ground to try to do a large community consultation well, at different levels, either group ones or door to door, but we really put this focus to continue the conversation. It's a conversation which needs to happen over and over so that people start changing, their habits. So yeah, we're quite keen on getting this dialogue continuing, because it's definitely part of the solution too.
From my perspective, I think there is also always a cost benefit consideration when we talk about centralized and decentralized LIDs. I think in general, if we talk about a parcel-based LID implementation versus the community-based, or simply just a group of a few cluster of houses, if you give them a goal of being water efficient or being green or things like that, and give them a choice and give them a budget, they probably gonna gravitate towards something a little bit larger rather than single parcel based. And if you think about a more of a city block or larger scale, there's always an interesting balancing act how to put different LIDs at different places. So I would say it's a it's something that I think people struggled for, depending on whether they are homeowners or, the developers or city managers or, people like this. They're, I think, always something to think about. I would say there are advantages and disadvantages at both, distributed versus the centralized LID.
David, I'm curious to hear your response to your own question.
So I think, for me, I think it really underscores the necessity of figuring out ways of, we cannot completely redo or reinvent previous infrastructure, and it probably wouldn't be entirely desirable as well as impractical to do. So what I guess my own answer to the question is that I think we need to look at creative ways to integrate LID into existing infrastructures, to make existing infrastructures more resilient in the overall operations and durability of the systems, and to make them better able to deal with things like seismic events, anything that would cut off, for example, large aqueduct systems. But in the process, also looking at ways that LIDs can enhance water supply in such a way that further reliance in the future on large infrastructural, large high energy input infrastructural efforts such as desalination are really minimized and become the last resort rather than the first resort. I guess that would be my overall way of looking at it.
And just one more thought, I sort of see a role of education in all of this too. In civil, I'm a professor in civil engineering. We educate engineering students who then go out and populate, for example, flood control programs and other municipal government programs involved in infrastructure. And if they don't know anything about the environmental impacts of stormwater or the sort of environmental benefits or human benefits of things like LID, then they're just going to go with where their knowledge base is. And so we have, as part of this project, I think, a real onus to try to bring that green infrastructure into the educational process. So, in fact, our proposal is kind of building around that idea. I'm just wondering, David, do you think for urban planners there's kind of a similar disconnect between the education and where they ought to be, or do you think that urban planners, when they leave the university academe, that they're fully prepared to address these with a kind of broad view?
I think traditionally urban planning tends to suffer from the same problem you're describing in civil and environmental engineering. And that is that most of our urban planning graduates are sort of prepared to work in settings in which they're going to be planning large infrastructure projects. And they're going to be working with large funding pockets. They're going to be creating projects that are going to be amortized over long periods of time. These are going to be projects that are very much mostly publicly funded, rather than partnerships between public entities and private entities. I think it's only been in the last few years as planning itself has become frankly, a more green discipline, that low-impact development and green infrastructure in general has been more widely embraced. And it seems to be sort of parallel, without putting too fine a point on it, the notion of low-impact development in, say, water supply and water management, and the notion of more green neighborhoods. For example, the notion of densifying urban areas, resisting the tendency for urban sprawl, thinking of ways to unpave our built environment. These things seem to be going together. And as you know, Stan, much of the education here has been to show how green infrastructure for water can be integrated with more attractive neighborhoods, more walkable neighborhoods, neighborhoods with more parks, more opportunities for alternative means of transportation. They all do seem to be part and parcel of one large paradigm shift, I think. And I think we're starting to see it in planning as we are in engineering, but it's been relatively recent.
Thank you.
Any questions that any of you have for one another, or any issues that we have not really expanded on, need to expand on?
Yeah, I had one, Dave. I was hoping to hear from the panel. And I hope it's not shifting the topic too much, but I wanted to see if anybody is thinking about LID with respect to social justice, particularly in Southern California. Access to LID can be something that might be really favoring communities with more money. And I know with the urban watershed management plans, a lot of communities have to come together because they're in the same watershed to develop strategies and solutions with using green infrastructure, but some of the communities that might not have as large of a tax base or money for these kinds of services might be left behind. So I'm wondering if anybody could comment on that. Thanks.
We'd like to respond to Brandon's question.
You know, I'm not an expert on social justice, but I think for the infrastructure, money flow in general, the disadvantaged community DAC, they have some advantages in terms of grant funding and things like that. I think for LID right now, because I think really putting LID into the hard regulatory requirement still is a process. It's not. It's still taking place. But in the past, when LID is not a hard requirement, a lot of projects are actually funded by grant, and again, the disadvantaged community have the edge over the other places. I do agree that in terms of the tax income, the more affluent communities do have more money to implement, and they are more willing to spend money for LID type of implementation as well. So how it's gonna change in the future, I don't have a clear answer yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that goes to the heart of how are we going to fund this, and I think how we're going to fund it is going to play a big role in the environmental justice aspects of it, because to a certain extent you're already seeing problems now. The urbanizing fringe is really the one that's benefiting from LID currently, at least in the U.S., and certainly the inner cities, not much is happening, so we're already heading the wrong direction.
I think I was talking to somebody in was working with the LA City Council, and they said that social justice and equity issues were almost involved in every single issue that they were voting on. So that it was, it may not be really front and center in the engineering sphere, for example, but that in the political sphere, it's absolutely front and center, at least in Southern California. Would you agree with that, David?
I would agree with it, and I think there's a couple of places where this plays out currently in Southern California where we're really seeing Brandon's question exemplified. One is the restoration of the Los Angeles River, and in fact, restoration of rivers in general. It's not a low-impact development issue per se, although restoring the river implies that you're going to do lots of other things to capture stormwater, to alleviate, irrigation flows into rivers as storm sewers and all the rest of it. But there's this real question about public access and who's paying for restoration and who's really going to benefit from it, and who benefits from the beautification of a neighborhood. So there's the cost issue, upon whom there's the cost fall, and who actually benefits. I think we're also seeing this there's a political scientist at USC, Sheldon Kamenecki, some years ago did a study of surcharges that were being proposed for alleviating, basically for reducing flood hazards in Los Angeles. And one of the things that he suggested is that most of the benefits would fall to people who live along the coast, who are very affluent in general, but most of the burdens would actually fall upon those far upstream in middle class or even poor neighborhoods. And that this is, something that can be demonstrated as being a real challenge for managing things like flooding.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate your answers. That actually helps a lot in my understanding of what's going on in Southern California.
Yeah, Brandon, I'm curious to have your response to your own question again.
Well, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about that aspect, but I suppose that I'm getting more involved in the community I live in, and it is probably considered one of the disadvantaged communities that you guys are referring to. And I know that the organizations that are working with the community are mostly, there's one faith-based organization, and there's a community center that people work with who are bringing things like urban gardening. And I know there are some city council members in LA that are working in the same respect to urban gardening to make it easier to rent out unused lots to people who want to use those spaces for urban gardens. But as far as LID, I still haven't heard a whole lot of talk about bringing these systems to communities that might not have the resources to build them as some of the other communities. But the services or the benefits they could get from those LID projects could be a pretty big deal, and that the services aren't equitably distributed would be kind of a shame. So, yeah, it was good to hear your responses on that topic. So thanks.
Well, and it certainly gets to the issue of public acceptance. That is to say, unless the advantages as well as the costs can be shown to be widely distributed in an equitable manner, that probably doesn't bode well for the long-term acceptability of LID.
I actually have a separate question, if it's okay to change the subject a little bit at this point. We've talked a little bit about sort of how wise it would be to build maintenance considerations, maintenance plans into these systems. Is there any talk of, or really good examples of building long-term sort of monitoring costs into these as well, so that we have some idea how they perform in the long term and can then better integrate them into sort of future plans?
Scott, any thoughts on that?
Well, there hasn't, unfortunately, the prototype scale stuff hasn't been in the ground long enough for us to really see what the long-term performance is, but we have done some studies on that, and the indications are that there really is pretty good performance over the life of the infrastructure. So in terms of there not being a big degradation of the performance over the life of the project, which is, you know, in urban infrastructure is about 50 years. So I think that, you know, as we gain experience, we'll determine the right level of monitoring that needs to go along with that. You know, John pointed out that you have to have some level of maintenance for these devices to continue to perform, and that's absolutely the case. And so if you're going to have maintenance, you're going to have some sort of you know, inspection program that goes along with that. But I would say that we want to be very careful about how much money is allocated to that, because it's going to be a very expensive proposition, and you want to make sure that you get, you know, a good return on investment. In other words, not overspending on maintenance and inspection, but certainly not underspending as well. And I think that we need more experience to determine what that right level is.
Stephanie? John?
Yeah, I think it's a bit similar in terms of, you know, how much perspective we have on and time and experience we have with the systems in place. There's definitely a recognition that all these systems, WUSID assets, have a much shorter lifespan than a road. We deal with them in the asset management plan that has a huge influence and will will need to be treated in a specific way to be able to address these renewal costs much higher. And that's something we're gonna need to address. I think it's as I was saying in my presentation, we're just at the stage where we're able to maintain it in an adequate manner. So in terms of the monitoring, that's going to go along with it. But there's and we are lucky enough in the Yarra Ranges to have this ongoing support with the LSC project, and they have all this monitoring system in place for years now in terms of the hydrology and ecological structure and how quickly they come back in the Little Stringybark Creek. So that's invaluable, and that starts showing incredible results, but or at least promising for continuing this small scale implementation of WUSID. But yeah, it's sort of you know, ongoing works. I don't think we've got a real answer on long term how to sustain that.
John?
Well, I think I probably missed the question. I guess it's about the long-term maintenance of LID and probably associated impact with it. Is that correct?
And monitoring. I think it's also about long-term monitoring and evaluation of the maintenance.
Okay. Well, that's you know, that's something that you know, I think is very important. That's one of the, you know, key aspects how we're gonna, you know, carry on with our project, because, you know, this is how in the design we designed into the project different LID features, you know, how we measure their performance over at least 20 years period. You know, I have to admit that you know, when I first made the promise, I didn't know that there are money, you know, attached to the promise, and because it's going to be done by another county agency, and they are complaining. John, did you know what you were signing up for? Well, I would say, you know, that you know, kind of you know, make a little bit more regional type of LIDs a little bit more attractive, because, you know, and public land, you know, just because these agencies are you know, more on the hook, or they are more you know, they tend to do a little bit better job in terms of LID maintenance. You know, one example, maybe not the perfect one, is you know, Orange County Water District's spreading basin. Just to take it as an example, it's a very extremely highly efficient way of getting the water into the ground. Even though it's not LID by definition, but it's just an example of how the proper maintenance can maintain the facility for very long term and very high level. They were able to do the very well-designed maintenance program to keep the infiltration rate for all the basins at a very high level for decades. It'll be hard to visualize that same thing happened to smaller scale private land type of BMPs. I think it'll chances are they will be neglected. So that's my perspective.
Well, it was interesting tying your question, Meg, back to something that Stephanie, you said in your presentation earlier, that one of the lessons, it's Little Stringybark Creek, is the need for evidence-based responses to what you're doing. And I think that ties in very much to Meg's question. Meg, how would you answer your question? What do you think needs to be done?
I always favor, when possible, monitoring. I mean, we've been running a couple small-scale biofilter experiments, and the amount of clogging that we saw the second time around was astonishing, and it's just a year. So these systems can change dramatically. And recently, at a job interview I did, I was talking to a group of folks who are interested in wide-scale implementation of LID as a way to deal with combined sewer overflow kinds of problems, and they took sort of their proposal to the board and explained the whole thing, and the final message was, great, we love LID, that would be fantastic, but you still have to do the traditional methods because we don't know that they'll work in the long term. So it just underlines that that sort of knowledge is something we really need.
Any further questions?
So just to kind of follow up with John's response too, it just seems like if LID were to be part of a stormwater management plan, and to address an MPDES permit issue, that there wouldn't in fact have to be monitoring associated with that to ensure compliance. Is that true?
Well, I think actually there will be. I think Scott probably can help me answer this question. I'm pretty sure for WQMP, water quality management plans, there are elements for that. I think for a facilities, they usually try to hire professionals to do the monitoring for them.
Yeah, the permits, it's kind of interesting now. The next evolution is that the permits are moving more to a performance-based approach. So, as long as you are making your receiving water quality numbers, in other words, you're not showing impairment to receiving water bodies within your jurisdiction, then you're in compliance with your NPDES permit. And so they're moving away from thou shalt do this, 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 and this to you guys design your plan, but it has to work, and you have to show us in terms of the receiving water quality that it is working.
I know too that the State Water Board, when they funded projects, they had a monitoring requirement, at least for some of their activities. And I don't know if that's ongoing, but my sense was it was a long-term deal. They would basically require monitoring over the duration of the project. So I'm not certain whether that's common among all of the funding mechanisms for these large infrastructure investments, but certainly my limited experience with the State Water Board suggests that such things exist.
Yeah, they nearly always do that with a lot of their grant projects, so that they can obviously show that there is a public benefit. But yeah, my response was more in terms of the larger, broader MS4 programs. Right. And it's interesting if you take a look at the new Central Valley Regional MS4 permit that they've just put out on the street. It has kind of two sections to it. One is a prescriptive section where they just tell you exactly what to do, The other one is, well, you can kind of design your own programs, and it's performance-based. And if you screw up and don't meet the performance objectives, then you are pushed back into the prescriptive side of the permit, and it's almost like a penalty box, and I believe you have to be there for, I want to say, like 5 years before you can go back to the performance-based program again. So it's interesting. We'll see. It's evolving, and I kind of like the market-driven approach. The less, let the market figure out what's best and what's cheapest to implement and gives you the highest return on investment and performance, rather than dictating all that through the permit. But we'll see. We're still kind of figuring that out, I think.
Yeah, if I can just add from the experience of the Little Stringybark Creek project once more, in terms of this monitoring aspect, they've started putting in place systems at the like in 2008, the first in the ground, and that's sort of now where they're able to formulate some of these results from a hydrological water quality and point of view, and some success on these fronts. However, on the ecological structure and come back, the macroinvertebrate, there's definitely a lag time, and they haven't been able to show that they have come back to pre-development level yet, and that's years after. So just in terms of the monitoring and this performance-based approach, I think we're going to need something in the meantime, just because that doesn't seem to be realistic for some of the indicators, and to use some proxy. So there's some interesting studies that we're doing in terms of, with the correlation between a good maintenance regime and some of the performance which would be correlated to this regime. And if we're able to prove that our maintenance regime is done properly, then we're able to say that it works. But I think we're going to have to use these proxy indicators in the meantime.
I had sort of one final question from my end, kind of a wrap-up question. As you all know, and as I think has been underscored by all the presentations, we sort of live in a culture, particularly in the United States, perhaps a little less so in Australia, of sort of immediate gratification, which is to say, if we're going to pursue some sort of strategy for dealing with water problems, we want to see results now. Elected officials want to see certain things demonstrated within a time horizon that's reasonable from the standpoint of their terms of office. The public, who is paying for this, as we've emphasized, wants to see some sorts of benefits now. Regulators who are looking at water quality issues and other issues want things to be measurable. And we've all talked about performance and monitoring and assessment. My question is, what's the message that we need to get out to the public and to decision makers about the reasonable time frames for evaluating the progress that LIDs will produce?
That's a good question.
Wow. Let me crack the question. I want to preface the answer by saying that, well, you say U.S. and Australia is this. Wait to say how China is doing things. I think there is a little bit issue of short-sightedness there. You'll see. But I would say, for the long-term monitoring, long-term performance, and with the progress of LID being implemented more and more, there's I think for the LID practitioners, including ourselves, myself, there is always a I'm very motivated in seeing the real receiving water response from the LID, because even though for the project that I've been involved with, project-wise they're really good, but how we can actually see the response in receiving water, from a mass balance point of view, you can't at this time. But over the long term, I think with the gathering of information, I'm very hopeful that we could see it. So you know, we will have to, you know, time will tell.
So David, I wonder if maybe Rebecca Brown's you know, hydrosocial contract theory is sort of helpful in this regard. In that, you know, she talks about the water-sensitive city as being a transition to thinking about these water issues not in terms of the here and now, but you know, what our children and their children will inherit. And so maybe that's kind of ultimately the way this dialogue needs to go. It's you know, we because these projects are so expensive, they are very path dependent, and the decisions that we make today will affect you know, generations to come. And so, you know, maybe that's the real shift in the dialogue. It's what can we do to create a society which you know, our children will want to live in.
And that we're actually bequeathing something to them that's better than maybe what we inherited with the old infrastructure schemes.
There's a lofty goal.
Well, you know, it all starts with the vision, right? I mean, I know we can sort of argue that it's a bunch of hooey, but ultimately, I think it is important to have, you know, maybe a bigger picture in mind. And honestly, I think that in past generations, there may have been more of a focus on future generations. I think, you know, I think about my father and my grandfather, and they were very focused on, you know, what their children and grandchildren would be able to accomplish. Mainly that they would you know, carry on their good name and do great things. But I, you know, I do think that there was a sense of pride in the future and the potential of the future. And I think we've maybe lost our way a little bit in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
How's that for an overgeneralization?
Yeah, I think it's right.
Yeah, it's a powerful message.
Yeah, and I think it's just continuing this, demonstrating that what the current way of doing things in the engineering sector and all the traditional way of doing drainage, you know, is just so damaging. So just emphasizing this message on, well, we don't know if this on its own will work or something else, but in terms of proving that we've done it the wrong way, and sometimes in the most expensive way too, when we put curb and drainage. Curb and channel, everywhere on our roads, you know, whereas we could do a nice road with a similar lifespan and no curb and channel with allowing water to go in swells. That would be a less expensive way of financing it. So when we say it's expensive, it's actually just shifting the money around and put it, you know, where we need it, but spending less in big infrastructure like we used to like it.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Scott?
I agree. I think you know, I think it took us several centuries to screw it up to where it is now, so we need at least half that to fix it. But I also think that we need to start, you know, everybody wants, you're right, instant results and instant gratification. That's certainly the way our society works now. And but I think that we also have to start educating people that they have to change their behavior. I can't go down to Home Depot and buy, you know, the gallon thing of Roundup and spray it on my property as much as I want, or a big 10-pound bag of Scott's Turf Grow and put it all over my lawn. I think, you know, if we want to have measurable improvements in water quality, that ship has sailed, and we need to start changing those public attitudes, as well as letting people know that, you know, the time scale for improvement is going to be, you know, years in some cases, but multi-decades in others. Absolutely, particularly for, you know, hydrologic regime changes. You're not going to see improvements in habitat that were destroyed from, you know, hydrologic changes, hydromodification. In a couple of years, that's going to take decades to see it.
Very good. Any further questions or thoughts?
Mike.
No, other than to say thank you very much, David, for running a really great symposium, and I enjoyed your questions and your thoughtful analysis of all the talks and weaving everything together. You're a master at that. So thank you very, very much for hosting this.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to say a very special thanks to all of you, to Andrea, to Stephanie, to Jian, to Scott, to Brandon, who had to leave, and who apologized because he had to run off to another symposium, and to you, Stan and Meg, and last, very definitely not least, to James for magically making all of this work. Thanks.
Hear, hear.
Everybody.
So I think that'll wrap it up for this evening. There is a survey on the event page along with the YouTube page that we would request any viewers to take along with those who participated in the survey. So I'll email that out to those of you who actually participated, but to the viewers there is a link on there that we are requesting you fill out if you have a moment to do. And once again, just like David said, thank you for everyone for participating. We're excited to see what these course modules do end up turning out like. So we'll be able to send you along that information once we have them all designed and ready to go.
Thanks very much, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone.
All right.
Bye.